Over the last 3 years, Washington has reduced business as usual borrowing by somewhere between $3 and $4 trillion over the next decade, depending on whether you count the sequester. And the annual deficit is falling and is expected to be below $500 billion this year for the first time since the financial crisis. Policymakers have largely declared victory and are ready to move on to other issues. Right now, in fact, we're arguing over whether to spend $300 billion on expired tax breaks or just $85 billion. So the question is, what are the economic implications of carrying a debt that now stands at $17.5 trillion? And are there still compelling arguments to act on deficit reduction?
Well, I think there are. There are three big economic challenges facing the country. One is, of course, recovery. The second is long-term growth. And the third is balance. And the last is very important for the other two. It's interesting, all the attention in Washington on both sides has been focused on the near-term fiscal situation, which was never really the big issue. The big issue is long-term. And I think Pete Peterson had it exactly right in his introduction, that this is about future orientation versus past orientation. And we risk becoming a nation of entitlements and interest payments, not able to make the investments in our long-term future. The numbers are staggering, but I think the bigger question are the choices it implies for the American people about growth and about what we expect government to be and do. How to get elected officials to embrace that, I don't know.
Alan?
Well, I think we have a window where we can act. I think our problem is not the near-term deficit. It's the intermediate and the long-term. We have it within our means to address it. I think the outlines were there in Bowles-Simpson and in grand bargain negotiations, which the president kept in his budget for an additional year. As being a small part of that process, it felt like the only people who were interested in reaching a grand bargain were the president and then John Boehner until he went to Plan B. I don't know if people have declared victory, but they certainly have moved on. And we do have this window because interest rates are still low. I think one way in which the public will feel the large debt that we've accumulated is by higher interest costs once we get back to full employment, which could be 2-3 years. That may be an impetus to act. And I think at that point also politicians will see some benefit from acting because interest rates presumably would come down the way that they did in the early 90s.
As advisors to presidents and presidential candidates, do you see this being a driving issue in the 2016 campaign? Will we return to it politically, or is it going to take an external force like rising interest rates to compel action?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think we will already see the beginnings of normalization of the term structure of interest rates around the time of the campaign. And I think you will see both major party candidates telling this story in their own way. I think the easy part about this, as Alan suggested, or easier part about it, is that the changes that need to happen don't have to happen today. And it's always easier for politicians to legislate things going down the road. And we shouldn't be so skeptical about that. The 1983 Social Security reforms happened gradually. There was an impetus to make them happen, and they did. So I'm with Alan on this. I do think there will be some pressures that bring people to the table.
Well, I think it will take an action-forcing event. It could be the Disability Insurance Trust Fund being exhausted. It could be higher interest rates. But one of the worrisome things that we've seen over the past few years is that Congress imposes action-forcing events on itself and then doesn't take action. Or worse yet, goes to the default of the sequester, which is certainly, I think, wide consensus in the wrong direction for the economy. So I guess my fear is we've reached a point of dysfunction where even the normal type of action-forcing event would not force action.
In the meantime, both parties have largely turned their attention to creating economic growth, which I'm not sure we know how to do, but Republicans think it involves cutting taxes, tax reform. Democrats think it involves investment in the economy and education in particular, in infrastructure. Is this pivot at this moment the right idea? And do you see areas for compromise? I mean, is there something that we can do given the political realities?
I actually think it is the right time for the pivot. We probably could have done better in the recovery, but the question is, where are we standing right now? And growth is the right question. And to my mind, the economy needs a jolt. And the jolt would be something that improves business people's long-term confidence. That would be tax changes, tax reform, trade reform, immigration reform, but yes, also public spending. I mean, I felt in '08 and still feel now that we need a long-term infrastructure commitment. The mistake, I think, that was made was looking for temporary, shovel-ready projects as opposed to a long-term commitment that gets business people going. So I think there's the room there for a compromise if we pivot to growth. You're right, we don't know exactly what will work, but I, for one, am not willing to accept the notion that we're in a permanently slow growth era.
I find myself in tremendous agreement with Glenn.
So great.
Could we start drafting some legislation?
And I would define the problem a little bit differently, perhaps. I think we've had a middle-class jobs deficit. If you look at job growth over the last 20 years, even before the recession, we weren't creating enough middle-class jobs. So the question is, how do we have a strategy to strengthen growth in the middle class? I think there's a lot of consensus around education. Of course, that's a long-term strategy. I think immigration reform is probably the lowest hanging fruit as far as economic and fiscal policy goes. It's kind of amazing the way CBO scored it as strengthening the economy and helping the budget. There's no question that we need more investment in infrastructure. So I think that there's a lot of areas where we can strengthen the economy. One area I would also emphasize is long-term unemployment. I think our greatest hangover from the Great Recession is the high rate of long-term unemployment, and the long-term unemployed are increasingly leaving the labor force. That's the normal pattern. After the recession in 2001, the same thing happened 2-3 years afterwards. So I think to keep our long-term growth potential high, we need to have some creative solutions to keep the long-term unemployed in the labor force and back in jobs.
You both have written at some length about this issue. Could you talk about what we could do to address that, and what are the consequences of not addressing it?
Well, I think Alan raises an incredibly important point because, first of all, it's a social problem for the country. The decline in the labor force participation rate since the onset of the crisis isn't just a story about demography and the elderly. It's a story about younger workers, too, and that there's a social cost of that kind of unemployment. To me, there are really two policy issues. The long-term one is we really need to rethink our retraining and training policies. A lot of those are from the 1930s. They're not for the economy that we live in today. The other issue, though, has to do with the Federal Reserve, because the question is how much slack is there in the labor market depends critically to Alan's point about how quickly you think some of the long-term unemployed might come back. If you think they're never coming back, there's not that much slack, actually, in the labor market. If you think they're coming back easily with higher demand, there is. So both for short-term policy and long-term policy, we need to think about this.
I mean, you've written about particular policies that are pretty interesting. I mean, what are your ideas for how we nudge these people, even older workers, back into the workforce?
Well, from where I sit, it depends on the part of the population. For younger workers, I think we need to make more generous the earned income credit and return it to a work support program as opposed to a family support program, that, powerful incentives to work, possibly coupled with wage subsidies. For older workers, I think we need to change the way we tax older workers for Social Security purposes. So I think there are a variety of ways of encouraging people to work. So I don't take it as inevitable that we can't turn part of this labor force participation rate around.
And Ellen, you've written about tax credits for employers. Are there other types of things? What should we be doing?
Well, first of all, I think we should recognize, as Glenn said, that this is a severe problem. I would look at a somewhat different set of solutions, I think, although probably in the same space. For example, unemployment insurance could be turned into wage loss insurance. And many of the unemployed, when they lose their job, are searching for a job that pays close to what they had before. We could have unemployment insurance, instead of pay benefits, make up half the difference when workers go back to work for some period of time. And I think that would be particularly effective for older workers. Another part of the problem we're facing in labor force participation involves women. And this is not a cyclical issue. It started before the recession. What had been driving post-war labor force growth in the US was more employment of women, and that peaked out around 2000, 2001. It's a bit of a mystery why. I think it's related to not having enough flexibility in the workplace in the US. If we look at other advanced countries, they've created more opportunities for women, more part-time, more flexible jobs. And I think that's an area where public policy can also help to strengthen the labor force.
The president has argued that one of our central economic problems is rising income inequality and stagnant mobility. To what extent is that true, and what, if anything, can government do about it?
You want to start?
Why don't I start?
Okay.
I think it certainly is true. That's what I call the middle class jobs deficit. We're creating an opportunities gap. We're not unique in the world in terms of having rising inequality, but it's been a much more acute issue in the US, and we've experienced a greater rise in inequality than most countries. Since other countries are facing the same types of economic pressures like globalization, technological change, clearly something about our institutions has led to greater inequality than we've seen, say, in Canada. And I think that this is a problem for a number of reasons. I think it's a problem because inequality builds on itself. Because of higher inequality, I think it's going to make it harder for children born in the bottom to move up to the top. And even if it doesn't change the odds of moving up, the consequences of being in the bottom are greater. And children who are born to families in the bottom are much more likely to stay in the bottom. So we've already seen that the correlation in income between parents and their children has increased as a result of I think, as a result of higher inequality. It also affects our politics. It affects our ability to reach consensus, because if different segments of the country for a long time haven't felt like they've shared in economic growth, it makes it much harder to pursue strategies which create winners and losers but help growth overall. And I think it also harms consumption, and I think that we've been seeing this in the short run, and it was probably a contributing factor to the crisis. The fact that middle-income families didn't keep up in terms of their income, but they wanted to keep up their consumption. That led to excess debt. Now, I think there were a lot of factors that contributed to the crisis. But we're certainly now in a situation where family spending has come back down to earth. And one of the aspects that has made this a weaker recovery than the average post-war recovery is that consumer spending, especially on discretionary items, especially on services, has been very weak. Durable goods consumption has been relatively strong. Business investment's been okay in equipment. I think given differences in marginal propensity to consume between higher income families and middle income families, that's going to be a drag on consumption. And I think we're seeing those effects already.
I think there's a big difference between the diagnosis and what to do about it. So I absolutely agree with Alan that there are forces in the world, mainly technological change and globalization, that are driving income inequality. And the way I think about it for the U.S. is, would I like to see 50 more people like a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs in our country? I think the answer to that is yes, at least from where I sit. That would definitely worsen inequality. And so the question is, how do I think about this? To me, the real question is about mobility. And we do know, frustratingly, that mobility hasn't really improved in the U.S., according to recent research. And this is something that ought to frustrate our elected officials and ought to frustrate economists, and it's what we ought to be spending our time on. And to me, that's about education, it's about training, it's about work support. So I agree that we have an issue to talk about, but if this is ineluctably being drawn to a question of taxation of the well-to-do, I think we're missing the point. Because other than leveling off the top trees in the forest, that's really doing nothing to help the mobility problem.
And yet at the same time, it seems that leading thinkers in the Republican Party are going in a direction far away from the kind of spending that Alan is talking about. Paul Ryan, for instance, has talked about cutting government spending on the poor and people who need help. How do we, if the answer is not to tax at the top, but it's also not to spend more money at the bottom, where is the room for compromise?
Well, I think we are going to have to spend more money at the bottom. To my mind, this is again about subsidies for work and a social insurance safety net for the least well-off among us. Going back to the introduction of the conference, what the nation can afford is a strong safety net for the least well-off. What we cannot afford is a cradle-to-grave middle-income entitlement state, which is what we currently have. So I think there is a reason to compromise and a willingness to compromise. The problem is, politically, that's very hard, because think about what I just said. It's not a matter of asking billionaires to pay more to help the poor. I think that would be an easy political solution. It's also asking middle-income people to make some changes in entitlements. That's why this is so hard.
And I guess I would say it's even harder than Glenn's description implies, because it's not only a matter of the bottom not keeping up now, it's also a matter of the middle not keeping up, which is a much harder problem to address, I think. And I think that the factors that have caused the rise in inequality go beyond technological change and globalization. As much as anybody, I've written that technological change has played a major role. On the other hand, we've had a weakening of institutions. Labor unions have been weakened. The value of the minimum wage after inflation today is lower than it was when Ronald Reagan was president. So we've had a set of institutional changes that have also contributed to the rise in inequality. I think some of the norms at work have changed. It's become acceptable to have much wider pay differentials at work, and I think that actually harms productivity. And I think more enlightened businesses are recognizing that they can do better with pay compression. They all do better. And I think fundamentally it's going to take the private sector to respond. You know, the rise in inequality came about mainly because of changes in private sector compensation practices. I think the norms have changed. I think maybe tax policy changes contributed to that. But I do think that it's possible to see some changes take place without public policy, just using the bully pulpit.
Both parties have called for tax reform, but I think they mean very different things by that. What should the goals be in rewriting the tax code? Should there be an element of addressing income inequality, or should it be directed entirely to the Republican conception of job creators and growth?
Well, I hope job creation and growth isn't a Republican conception. I hope it's a national one. And to me, the goal of tax reform would be to increase economic growth. If we want to redistribute, we can and do it greatly on the spending side. So to me, the right tax reform is lowering marginal rates and broadening the tax base. And there are many ways to do it. You could have a consumption tax, you could have an income tax. Bowles-Simpson had lower marginal rates, much broader tax base. You know, anything in that flavor I think we should consider. And then use the spending side to be able to address problems that we have with inequality. So I think the tax code ought to be about growth.
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of space to improve the tax code, but tax code is also about paying for the functions that the public wants the government to provide, and we have to make sure that it does raise enough revenue to do that. There's not necessarily a conflict between making the tax code more efficient for the economy and more progressive. Closing tax expenditures is one way to do that. Now, I have a fear that when you open up tax reform, it makes things worse rather than better. All those loopholes are there for a reason. And it proved incredibly hard to close tax expenditures. People think it's fine in the abstract, but when they think about the home interest mortgage deduction, or if they think about deductibility, state and local government taxes and so on, it just becomes impossible. And on the corporate side, I think it's even harder. I think where I would emphasize is the corporate side, particularly, and Glenn probably agrees with this, it's hard to conceive of a worse tax code than the one that we have on the corporate side. It doesn't raise much revenue. It gives incentives to keep money abroad. It gives incentives for inversions of companies. It distorts economic activity in all kinds of ways. So there I think there's a lot of scope for improvement. On the other hand, I also worry that once you open things up, the interest groups are much more powerful than the groups interested in a more efficient, more neutral tax code.
Can I just wait on this? Because on corporate, the problem with saying just corporate reform, the corporate tax code is a mess. It needs a lot of reform. But remember how many businesses in the nation operate in individual tax-paying solutions. When you open up corporate reform and change the rates and the base without doing it on the individual, so you're almost drawn into individual tax reform by necessity, which I think is what's pulled people back a little bit from corporate reform. The reason I think we're going to get tax reform is not because economists are agitating, but from a conservative perspective, it's the single biggest thing you could do for growth. On the left, you can't pay for the budget that this country, the trajectory we are on with the tax system we have. Not going to happen. Because the most it can raise is 18, 19%. of GDP, maybe a little bit more. I think the highest may have been close to 20. So if we want to stay on this budget path, we have to change the tax system anyway. So no matter what your objective is, you're going to come to the table.
Well, that gets to the complicated question of whether we raise additional revenues in tax reform, which, has been the political sticking point for the past so many years. How do we, I don't think Democrats are willing to accept dynamic scoring, or at least so far have been unwilling to do so, and Republicans have been unwilling to accept tax hikes. So how do we bridge that gap?
I don't even think taxes is the first order fiscal policy question is how much do you want to spend? Because Alan was right. Once you set that, you have to have a tax system that can raise that. So if as a country we want the budget path we are now on, we will have to pay more. I don't think that's the right path, and I think we ought to make changes. But we ought to answer that question first, then you can answer the tax question.
Care to jump on that one?
Well, I think the country has spoken. I think the country doesn't have too much interest in cutting back on entitlements. On the spending side, and maybe this changes the subject a little bit, one development which is worth emphasizing is the slowdown in the rate of growth of healthcare costs. And the budget outlook looks better. It's not solved, but it looks better because healthcare costs have been growing more slowly. The further we get away from the recession and the more it persists, it suggests it's a structural change. I suspect that the Affordable Care Act accelerated some of the changes that were taking place in the payment system and delivery system in the healthcare sector already. And in that sense, I think to try to get us on a better spending path, getting the Affordable Care Act to work well, to continue to work well, I'd say, in terms of restraining the growth of costs, should be a high priority for everyone.
Would you agree with that, Glenn?
Well, the sticky wicket, I think, for the country is that if we're going to accommodate this spending level, that Alan says the American people want, everyone's taxes have to go up. You can't tax the rich and pay for this government. It's just not going to happen. There's just not enough revenue there. So the real perturbation, the real policy choice is, does everybody want to pay more for this? So when you say people don't want to cut, I think that's because you're not posing the question. How about a menu that has the prices on it? And then ask them, and then I'm not so sure what the answer is.
The problem, of course, is the very popular programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Neither party has really been willing to tackle that. And I'm wondering, where is the trigger going to come from to spur that on? The president offered chain CPI, the most obvious example, which Republican leaders said they wanted, and yet it was mocked and nothing happened.
We should take it. No question about it. To me, we have to get serious about this, and you start with principles that we should, if anything, be strengthening benefits for the least well-off among us. And we can afford to do that. And there are many plans that would scale back benefit growth for upper middle income and upper income households. It's actually not that hard to do. And I think if we can focus this on, that's where the adjustment is, as opposed to low income people, we should be able to do this.
And do you see hope that thread is developing in politics?
Not really. I don't know what you think, Al.
I was pleased to hear you said we should take the change CPI. On the issue about tackling some of the entitlement growth, the Affordable Care Act does that. It cuts Medicare Advantage, and there was a big political price to pay for that. There's still a lot more, I think, that could be done to restrain the growth in healthcare costs. And then it comes to an issue of how can the government provide these services more efficiently, because the public clearly wants them. And at least when it comes to healthcare costs, there is some scope for improvement. And I think we're seeing some of the benefits from those steps that have been taken.
Given the political realities, is there one thing, and obviously the next couple of years are going to be just as hard as the last few, regardless, I think, of what happens with control of the Senate, but is there one thing we can do to make things better, do you think, on any front, whether economic growth, long-term deficits? Give us some hope for the next couple of years.
My hope would be, I think what Alan mentioned earlier, which is immigration reform as being the most obvious. It should be in both sides' economic and political interests to accomplish that. And it would provide a signal far beyond immigration reform that says, look, we can talk about big things that are contentious and come to a solution. If we get one of those through, maybe we get others. But that seems to me the most plausible of all the ones we've talked about.
I agree with that completely. For a long time, I held out hope for infrastructure investment. And, you know, Republican congressional districts, they have roads that need repair. They have ports that they want to expand. You look up the eastern seaboard, and everybody wants to deepen their ports to accommodate the larger ships coming through Panama in the future. But the dysfunction has prevented that. So it's hard to be terribly optimistic that Congress is going to achieve much that's big over the next couple of years. I think they'll probably do some things. I think the biggest thing they could possibly do is immigration reform.
And what about in terms of, you know, some kind of effort at spurring economic growth? Is there a tax credit? Is there something that you could see the parties agreeing on?
Well, I mean, tax reform would be an obvious thing, and I agree with Alan, the corporate tax code is the right place to start. I'm just not sure they'll come to agreement, because once you start getting in the middle of that, it does take you to the individual tax code pretty fast, and there I expect things will bog down.
And are there consequences for waiting another 2 years? I mean...
Missed opportunity. Missed opportunity.
I think Glenn and I can certainly come to some agreements.
So we're not running for office. George Bush once said to me in an argument, I can see which one of us has life tenures. Politicians are on a different horizon.
Well, with that, our time is about up. I very much appreciate you gentlemen taking my questions. And
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
for
Lori.
being here.